Olá, boa tarde a todos. Estamos aqui ao vivo para a nossa segunda conferência do CEVE, 11º CEVE. Eu sou o Vitor Bianconi Menini, sou doutorando pela Unicamp, membro do NEVE, e vou aqui hoje apresentar o Dr. Grégory Cattaneo, que tem mestrado e doutorado pela Universidade da Islândia. Atualmente trabalha na sua habilitação na École Pratique des Hautes-Études de Paris. Já traduziu uma variedade de trabalhos do islandês para a língua francesa, em temas distintos como literatura medieval, folklore, histórias locais e também história contemporânea. A apresentação hoje vai lidar com o conceito de Hof no início da Idade Média islandesa. Vou fazer a apresentação em inglês agora e passar a palavra para o doutor Grégory. So, Grégory Cattaneo, Master and PhD at the University of Iceland, currently working in his habilitation at the École Pratique des Hautes-Études in Paris, translated a variety of Icelandic works into French, concerning themes on medieval literature, folklore, local histories, and contemporary history. So, Grégory, I would like to welcome you today to your presentation and express how happy we are of having you talking to us about early medieval Iceland. So, the floor is yours, and I'll be here later for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Vitor, for this very nice introduction. And I'm very happy to be part of this amazing idea. And hopefully it will give birth to many other similar conferences. And I'm very happy because I'm based in Iceland and I'm allowed to talk to a lovely Brazilian audience and maybe others all around the world. So as Victor said, my name is Grégory Cattaneo. I'm, as you can tell from my very bad English accent, I'm French originally, and I've been living in Iceland for 19 years. And today I was wondering what I would be, most likely to talk about. And one subject has been on my list for quite some time now. It's part of my research. I've been working on that for like more than a decade. It's the concept of Hof, like Victor saying in the introduction. And of course I had like a trendy title to seduce you and have you come and listen to my presentation and don't have it too boring. So we're going to go beyond temples and pagan priests, all of this in brackets, and we will try to understand this concept of Hof in early medieval Iceland and see through two main sources like what we can get from that. So the first source I'm going to be using will be mostly based on archaeological research, and the second one will be mostly philological, and we're going to go deep into the sagas, and we're going to study some key concept associated with the concept of Hof, some like construction, semantic construction about it. So as you must know, we have various types of explanation today in research regarding the famous question of temples in Scandinavia. So I'm not going to go ahead and tell you if they were or not, as I believe temples over there. But I want to bring the conversation a little bit somewhere else and go to ancient Iceland, because this is my field of expertise and my specialty. So I'm going to start to introduce you to what we call today in archaeology the festive hall, which was in some ways a place of worship in ancient Iceland. So I'm going to dig into that with this idea that the Hof, so the terms, the building terms with the word Hof, were designating for us in the 9th and 10th centuries center of power. So we've been working a lot in Icelandic history with this concept of center of power, mostly for the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries onwards. But now I want to bring the conversation a little bit earlier, having archaeology as a tool, and see what has been done for a while on this Hof. So in contemporary archaeology, the term Hof, like I said earlier, refers to the festive hall of the Viking era residential building that we call also the Longhouse or Langhus in Old Norse, in which we believe rituals such as libation and all the type of blood or sacrifices could take place. But at the same time, these places had a purpose in the secular life because they were center of power during the 9th and 10th centuries. So the medieval narratives describing places of worship in ancient Scandinavia must be understood always in the context of their writing. We're going to go further more on this in the second part, but just focusing on archaeology, we can have a complementary and sometimes, if not often, dissonant evidence regarding the significance and nature of these places of worship during the so-called pagan era, and of course the period of the Christianization, which took quite some time in Iceland, but that would be another subject as interesting. So the Icelandic archaeology informs us about places of worship described in the narrative sources, and let's dwell in one source as an introduction, which is kind of different because it's the legendary saga, or so-called legendary saga, the Frithjof saga in Frankna, which is supposed to happen on the western coast of Norway, so where some of the settlers came from before they moved to Iceland during the settlement period. And in this place, we describe the sacred woods of Baldur, so Baldurshagar, in a place called Sogn on the western coast of Norway. And it's very interesting because they will describe us what the temple or so-called temple were supposed to look like. So I'm quoting the saga. So I have translated the saga roughly in English because I did not want it to cut myself from the audience by just giving the quote in Old Norse. So we will have it in English, and for keywords, I will have them in Old Norse. So the text goes as this: there was a refuge and a great temple surrounded by a sturdy fence. There were numerous idols, but Baldur was particularly venerated. The pagans held these places in such scrupulous reverence that it was forbidden to cause harm to any animals or people within, and men were not allowed to have contact with women. This Fornaldasögur, or legendary saga, provide actually various accounts of these pagan temples. In the 19th century, the scholars extensively discussed the existence of these ancient Scandinavian places of worship. To get an idea of the romantic vision that scholars had of this temple at the turn of the 20th century, let's read what one of the most famous Belgian philologists wrote, Felix Wanner. He wrote that originally, and I'm quoting, the Scandinavians did not have any temple. They worshipped their deities in the open, in sanctuary deep within sacred woods, later in the mountain, near certain spring, or by riversides. In times, they constructed buildings of mostly unknown architecture, what is known in that they were vast wooden structures containing in separate sections a sanctuary with stone or wooden altars and idols. The images of the god were usually carved from wood, so the terms are like tregod or skurgod, in life size, or, according to Grimm and Simrock, made from a paste of flour hardened by baking and coated with fat or oil. They were often adorned with precious garments, gold and silver. In front of the god, an eternal fire burned on a platform. On the altar, the silver ring or bögur, used for swearing oath, was placed, along with the large copper bowl, blótbolli, intending to collect the blood of the sacrifices, which the priests sprinkled on the statues, the temple walls, and the entire assembly gathered around him. Later in Iceland, there were private temples, and it's more interesting for us, called blóthús, or house of sacrifice, or even Hörgur. The great pagan temple was known as Hof, or Góðahús, house of the Góði, priest, or district chieftain. According to Finnur Jonsson, so he's quoting the Icelandic scholar, in Scandinavia, the word Hörgur, originally meaning mountain or rock, specifically referred to a temple dedicated to goddesses where women presided over sacrifices. So we can see that we come a long way today, but at that time, with the saga in one hand, the archaeologists of that days, that we call antiquarian archaeologists, endeavored to locate the temples in the Northern Island, as stipulated by a survey commissioned by the Royal Commission for the Preservation of Antiquities So the Danish government was funding this survey in Iceland. And then, thus, from the 19th century to the early 20th century, archaeologists identified over 100 of sites in Iceland believed to be either a hof, like I explained, or a hörgur, a number much greater than the hof mentioned in the medieval sources or sagas. For example, the Book of Settlement, or Lonnama book, records 13 hof and contains 37 farms with the toponym or place name Hofstaðir, place of hof, place of temple. Construction using also the hof element or derived from it. In Iceland, place name studies or toponymy offers numerous examples of ancient temple sites. Place name either contain the term hof, temple, or consist of a compound noun built with hof as the first element. Thus, we can count around 40 farms in Iceland called either Hof or Hofstaðir, or even others named Hofdalur, Temple Valley, or Hofgarður, Temple Enclosure, even though it seemed that originally the element Hof used in these toponyms referred to a hill and not a temple, akin to Hof in Rangárvellir, which is a famous toponym, place name. Over the last century and a half, the conclusions regarding pagan ritual and the existence of temple have changed significantly. Today, the image that I described from Felix Wagner of the temple as a separate building, as known from medieval account and championed by early Icelandic archaeologists like the famous Sigurður Vigfússon, it has fallen out of favor of fashion. The Hof no longer designates a temple, but today we believe it's mostly to designate something that we call the Great Hall of a Viking Age dwelling, in which rituals like libation and sacrifices could take place. Recent archaeology in Iceland has followed the direction offered by the Danish archaeologist Olaf Olsen and his theory of farms/temples. And we have two hypotheses still running today and not necessarily mutually exclusive that can help us understand the sacred nature of the ancient Icelandic farm. The first hypothesis, following the footstep of Olsen works, considers that a part of the Scandinavian and Icelandic longhouse, the famous langhus, was dedicated to sacrificial practices such as feasting and libation. This explains the absence of a separate and monumental building called a temple in Norse sources, as it was, as we believe, an integral part of the longhouse, specifically the part called the Great Hall, so Hall or Hut, which was used for this purpose. The Icelandic archaeology, has discovered or uncovered some great halls over the past century. You have them here all mapped together, which were used for this purpose. So in order of excavation, I have mapped them, you can see on the PowerPoint, but we have, in order of excavation, we have Skallakot in Þjórsárvöllur from the 11th century, Snjáleftar Totir in Þjórsárvöllur, also tells to 12th century, Ísleifsstaðir in Borgarfjörður in the west from the Viking period, Klövanes in Svarfaðardalur, Viking period too. We have Bær near Gjáskogar, also in Þjórsárvöllur, tells a lot about this place. Just a little note I was showing you before, one of my favorite places in Iceland, Þórsmörk. So it's really like on the edge of Þjórsárvöllur, is on the other side of the valley. But we have a lot of places, and the name Þórsmörk, so the place or the enclosure or forest of Thor, or place to dedicate, was mostly believed by folklorists. It was believed to be like a place of sacrifice or a place of cult. in the open, where the forests play a major role in this. So it was an open area, and it's really funny to see that we have, like, on the next valley in Thorsadalur, on the other side of Thorsmörk, we have that many longhouse that might have been used for this purpose. I'm going a little bit further on this later on. Okay, for Thorsadalur, then I have next to Thorsadalur, also in the south, I have Kvitarholt in Runamanarepur, also from the Viking period. Then again, we go back to Thorsadalur with Samstaðir, so it's after 1000 and before the eruption of 1104, which actually was quite huge in this valley. Then we go to the little island. You can see on the southern part of my map, you have Erjolfsdalur in Vestmannaeyjar, Viking period. Then we have Greljutotir in Arnarfjörður, 10th century, Granastaðir, famous one in Eyjafjarðardalur in the north, 10th century. Even more famous, the one of Gavin Lucas and Ori Vestensson, Hofstaðir in Mývatnssveit, that's from more precisely around 950, 1070. We have the one of Jesse Bayok, Risbru in Mosfellsdalur, early 10th century to early 11th century. We have Holmur in Laxárdalur, Viking period. Eriksstaðir, of course, in Haukadalur, one of my favorite one, was there like a couple of weeks ago. Then we have the famous longhouse located on number 14 and 18 of Aðalstræti in the heart of Reykjavik, so 950, 1050. Svegakot in the north in Mývatnssveit from 950 around 1200. Vatnsfjörður was Karen Millek, if I remember, that was excavating it in Ísafjarðardjúp, so in the West Fjord, 900 to 1000. And then Vogur in Hafnir from the Viking period, so Kenes Peninsula, so next to the airport for those who know Iceland a little bit. So all this to show you that we have been, Icelandic archaeologists have been excavating quite a lot of longhouse, which could be interpreted as a famous festive hall, like the first Olsen theory. We have it working. For those who want to read one good monography, will be the one that I mentioned earlier of Cultus Hofstaðir, which is amazing. You have more than 20 years of research, and they go back also from the antiquarian part of the research, and you have a full case study on Northern Iceland. It's really a must read if you're interested in this subject. The second hypothesis, which is also innovative and original, still concerns building of the Icelandic farm, but suggests reinterpreting the role of a particular building, the semi-subterranean dwelling or semi-excavated house, it's a technical term, that could have been used as a sacrificial house or blóthús. This hypothesis diverges from the traditional interpretation of this building, which was previously considered a temporary dwelling, a residence for slaves, sauna, or a structure housing a workshop, such as one occupied by women, for example, dedicated to the production of the woolen textile or vadmal that you all know about. So this semi-excavated house that we call in Icelandic, in modern Icelandic, jarðhús, or in German Grubenhaus, or pit house in English, it refers to a building with an area of less than 4 square meters, located in a rectangular pit featuring straight walls and roughly flat bottom. It's situated below the ground surface, hence its name, semi-excavated house. And in contrast to archaeological trends suggesting the absence of sacrificial dwellings in Iceland, one Icelandic scholar, archaeologist called Bjarni Einarsson, based on examples from excavation at the Holmur farm near Hornafjörður in southeastern Iceland, a place that I use as a case study for my own PhD on communities in this area in Iceland. This place, so this excavation dating from the early days of the settlement of Iceland, offers interpreting the semi-excavated house as a sacrificial house. This theory would have paved the way for the interpretation of transition of worship, which is something we have been working on in Northern Europe, and it has been mostly brought to Iceland by Professor Steinunn Kristjánsdóttir in her PhD on the conversion church in the eastern part of the Northern Island. So it's in the east of Iceland in Seyðisfjörður, so next to Egilsstaðir today, and it's called Þórarinsstaðir. And I think it's the one, no, it's not this one. This one is Gerstaðakirkja, but it basically looks like that. So we have some, I think we have 5 today reconstruct churches that look exactly like this, that we call like conversion churches. And when she was working on this, it's basically the theory is that we had this type of houses in Iceland at one certain point to ease for the conversion of the Icelander, to ease these converters, is their job into converting the local communities. I wrote extensively on the subject, but as you know, in the Western and Northern region, this theory of transition of worship is quite old. It dates from the early Middle Ages, and it's basically one document, an epistolary document, a letter from Pope Gregory the Great, written to Abbot Mellitus around 601. And the text, so I have it, I did the translation from Latin, and I will quote you this text, and it's been very influential in the way we converted the northern people. I mean the Roman Church converted the northern people. So it says this: the temples of the idols should not be destroyed in this country, talking about the conversion of Great Britain, but rather the idols that are found in them should be destroyed, and holy water blessed and sprinkled in these temples. Altars should be set up and relics placed there. For if this temple had been well built, it is essential that they should be transferred from the worship of demons to the service of the true God. In this way, the people will no longer have cause to sacrifice animals to the devil, but can kill them for food to the praise of God, the giver of all good. It goes ahead along, if you allow them to retain the exterior of the temple, let them have no doubt that the interior will soon be abandoned. Therefore, my beloved sons, rather than seeing them perish in the corruption of paganism, overthrow the idols and cleanse the places with holy water. The people will then have the greater satisfaction of seeing that they are not deprived of their old tradition, but have merely exchanged their errors for the truth. According to this very interesting letter, the former buildings of pre-Christian worship are repurposed to practice the priesthood of the new religion. The CEVE conduct formula, or what we call Trygdamál or Gríðamál, is actually an Icelandic text preserved in several medieval texts, which echoes the theme of Gregory the Great's letter, drawing a parallel between the places of worship of Christians and pagan, namely the church on one hand, the temple on the other hand. The Christian, and I'm quoting the Gríðamál basically from all this manuscript we have, all this tradition, the main text, the core of this self-conduct formula is the same. It's the Christian go to the church, the pagan sacrifice at the temple. Even today, this theory of the transition of worship remains present in Icelandic archaeology, and mostly when we study these so-called conversion churches like the one you can see on the PowerPoint presentation. Then I have one more point which is interested. It's from Ori Vestensson, so the famous historian, archaeologist, and professor at the University of Iceland. For him, he came up with very interesting hypothesis in 2 complementary studies that we might have also like a link between the famous temple or so-called temple sites, so Hofstaðir, and the assembly sites in Iceland, Þingstaðir. And he basically interprets the Hofstaðir as local centers with a connection to the sacred. It's very interesting topics, but it will take us like well longer to go into that, and I want to go to my written sources and not overrun my time. But that would be the subject for another conference with like speciality and power. But But I know you had like similar stuff. I mean, tomorrow my colleague Gisli will give something on place and even and all this stuff. So you will have some speciality. But just to give it like in a couple of stuff for him, like when he's been looking at sites from the 10th to 11th century, featuring both an assembly site and a temple, corresponded to central sites, basically in ancient Iceland, and all of these were located within about 10 kilometers from each other, which is interesting. He also cautions the practical validity of the constitutional model, meaning that more than 12 or 13 assembly sites could have existed in the 10th century, which is very interesting. And the location of these regional assemblies may have changed, which I totally agree. So in this approach, the number of the assembly sites were around 17 during this time, but not according to the official constitution of Iceland. So all that is another subject. I won't bother you with that. But to go back a little bit on my slide, because I see I haven't been showing them too much. So this is the aerial view of Hofstadr, photo taken by Ori Viestensen, and you can see that the festival is in the middle. Then I had some old school antiquarian drawings. So this one is from, because I don't have the view of the PowerPoint, sorry, I'm just going to show it to you. Yeah, it's from Adolf Fredriksson, who is running the Institute of Archaeology in Iceland. Work also a lot on assembly site and temple or antiquarian archaeology. It's a must read also. Then I had a reconstruction, so that's my favorite. It's Erikstadir, so the famous Erik the Red, the band outlaw that moved to Greenland. And it's in this house. This one is the reconstructed one. The archaeological site is just behind it. It's in this house that Leifur Eriksson was born, famous Viking. This one also is another long house that I mentioned in my long enumeration of long houses. And going from there, we're going to go, and I'm saying I'm good in timing, we're going to go to history and philology. And I'm going to show you my second part, which is basically a reinterpretation. So we've been dealing with Hof. I've been going extensively on that. Now I want to go around two other construction or concept. So I'm going to reinterpret for you the concept of temple chief or chieftain, Hofgodi, and its feminine version. And then the concept of temple tax or Hoftotler in the Norse sources. And the timing is perfect because I had a publication like a couple of weeks ago on the tithing and tithe in medieval Iceland with the translation of the Graugaus into French. So my concept basically super easy for those familiar with the saga is like do the saga, which depict priest and priestess in the ancient Norse cult, provide insights into the practitioner of the ancient Nordic paganism or into the Christianized society of medieval Iceland and its ideology. So, as most of you know, the sources describing pre-Christian Iceland depict some early leaders during the Iceland's settlement using the term Hofgodi with its plural term Hofgodar, which can be translated as temple priest, which I don't really like, or temple chief or chieftain. So it's been a lot of literature and studies on the term. There's been a lot of work on Godi and Godar. I wrote myself, I spent more than a decade working on Godar. I wrote on Godarmen. I have like 300 pages of my of work on the list of all the Godar and the Godarmen that existed in Iceland, and that's why I agree a lot with Ori Viestensen saying that they were other assembly site or the system, and that it's another subject, but it's interesting. So these leaders, they stand out from the other settlers by building places of worship immediately upon their arrival on the island. According to the classification established by our friend now, the Danish scholar Olaf Olsen, these places can be a temple, Hof, a place of worship, Hörgur, or even a sacrificial cairn, Höger. So I can see that the slide were not in order because that's what looks like a sacrificial cairn. This one is from Thingvellir National Site, and I had like some places like Höger. Nope. Okay, but just to show you how it should look like. All right, and one famous example we have found in both medieval version of the Landnama book, so the Sturlu book and the Högs book, recounts, and I'm translating the Landnama book here, so Thorhattur the Elder was a great leader and a temple chief in Trondheim at a place called Maere. Intending to go to Iceland, he first dismantled his temple, taking the soil and pillars with him. When he arrived in Stöðvarfjörður, so in the East Fjord, he consecrated the entire fjord in the manner of Maere, where he came from, allowing nothing to be slaughtered there except livestock. Here we have a story, okay, where the settlers undergoes a transition of worship from his land of emigration in Trondelag, so no Trondelag, or around Trondheim in Norway, known for its sacrificial practices and its Hof temple. Okay. In his catalogue of the income sources for the holders of Godord or Godordments, an Icelandic legal historian or legal scholar called Ludvig Ingvarsson that wrote a huge monography of 3 volumes called Godord and Godordmen, so the Godord and the holder of, or the owner of the Godord. He estimates, this Icelandic scholar, that these people were receiving a temple tax, which we call Hoftotler. This statement raises 2 issues concerning the status of a Godi and a Godord mother being equated or equivalent to the one of the Hof Godi. The first issue relates for us to the gender of this role. In Iceland, all the Godar were men, even though a few women could temporarily hold the Godard in a situation such as the transition of inheritance from a deceased father to a male heir. And as evidence, the non-Godi is exclusively masculine, while the non-Hof-Godi exists in a feminine form, Hof-Gyðja, priestess of the temple. One saga, supposed to describe events happening in the Westfjord, the famous Vaptfirðinga saga, is the sole source in all of our corpus that presents a character described as a priestess or Hofgyða. Her name is Stenver, and she officiates in the main temple, Höfuð Hof, of the eastern region of Iceland. All the peasants of Vapnafjörður are required to pay the temple tax of Totlur, because it is stipulated by the law. And the text the saga is quoting, the word the saga is quoting is lögskyldur. The Icelandic historian Jón Viðar Sigurðsson regards the Hof-Totlur in his PhD as a participatory fee rather than a tax, which contradicts actually the testimony we have in the Vaptfirðinga saga. Indeed, the plot of the saga underscore that those who do not pay the temple tax can be summoned and sentenced in the local assembly court. Here, in this case, the tax is exploited by a powerful man called Brodhelgi to get rid of his rival, the Christian Thorleifur, who refuses to pay it, arguing that this contribution is being misused. In this case, the Hofgodi and its female counterpart, the Hofgyða, do not precisely correspond to the status of a Godor mother or a Godi in ancient Iceland, at least not according to the constitution we have. We can also add another source, the Regdala saga or Vigaskute, very interesting text, one of my favorite saga, which features the character of Ljótur, Hofgoði of Þverá, who gained notoriety during a food crisis episode around 975. In this narrative, he suggests that the people of the valley of Reykjadalur and the community of inhabitants of Reykjadalur should offer sacrifices to the temple in order to remedy to the situation, including old school tradition like exposing children and killing the elderly. Very fun tradition that were quite famous in the legendary sagas. In these stories, he opposes himself to Áskell Eyvindarson, the Goði of Hvammur, and the editor of the saga, a very notorious philologist called Björn Sigfusson, notes that while the Hofgoðar were responsible for the temple and priestly manners, they did not possess the same power as Goðar, as demonstrated by Áskell's influence in this episode. I work a lot on that, and I had like a keen insight on this matter, highlighting that the Hofgoði does not exhibit a dominant sentiment towards the community. It distinguishes this role from that of a Goði or Godor mother, who would become afterward, Áskell, will become the future official leader in this text by becoming a Lögsögumaður, becoming really from his region a very like national-wide important man. So according to this reasoning and examples from many sagas and book of settlement, the Goði did not hold a priestly position as some historian might have believed before. The second issue we can have with the assertion of Ludwig Ingvarsson in his theory is the chronological ambiguity we have in his work, because he's considering the pagan period, referred in his text just as Iheidni, as a whole. By systematically revisiting the account in the saga, we observe that narratives featuring Hofgoði, Hofgyða, and Goði character all take place during the colonization period, the settlement period, which spans from the last quarter of the 9th century to the first third of the 10th century, before the adoption of the famous constitution of Úlfljótur. A narrative that deals with the beginning of Christianization in Iceland by the effort of Bishop Friðrekur and Thorvaldur, and preserved in one short story called Thorvaldsstatur Víðförla, states, these men, and many others in the northern quarter became entirely Christian, though unbaptized at the time, they believed in Christ, renounced idolatry and all pagan custom, and refused to pay the temple taxes. This episode is dated to the 1940s, so 60 winters before Christianity was legally accepted in Iceland, according to the text. During a time when many Icelanders were converting to Christianity, there were instances of refusal to pay the temple tax. However, the text does not elaborate on legal measure taken against this Christian, as we have, for example, in the testimony of the Vaptfirðinga saga. So all that to say that the chronological question remains the primary issue in all the accounts concerning this famous temple tax or Hoftollur. Is it a genuine practice of the old Scandinavian religion, or is it, like I believe, a Christian tithe transposed onto the pagan past? How long did this practice continue in Iceland, and which period do the sources depict? For Ari the Wise, at the end of chapter 2 of his Book of Icelanders, we have a lengthy discussion at the General Assembly that temple existed in Iceland during the first third of the 10th century. He even goes further, and he explained that the foster brother of Úlfljótur, Grímur Geirsskör, was paid for traveling the country in search of the future site for the Alþingi. and I'm quoting, and everyone in the country gave him pittance of food for this, and then he handed over this money to the temples. For the historian Jacob Benedictson, Icelandic historian, we could interpret this seemingly as a seemingly selfless act as a Christian practice of offering for the salvation of the soul, which actually Arias transposed himself into a fantasy pagan past. However, the most interesting information comes from other narrative sources. When we delve into this documentary dossier, we find that certain accounts describe the arrival of settlers in various regions of Iceland and the establishment of a temple and a temple chief. These theories are highly similar and likely stem from one common source, although we still struggle to determine with certainty which one is the oldest. The fragments I have selected are derived from the sagas of Icelander and some of the medieval redaction of the Landnáma book, which I consider as a pseudo-history narrative, following one of my old masters, the Professor Sverrir Thomasson of the Árni Magnússon Institute in Reykjavik. These narratives align, and when studied together, they provide insight on both the status of our famous temple chief and the temple tax. So we're going to go a little bit deeper into that. So firstly, preserving the Sturlubók and Högsbók redaction of the Book of Settlement, we have this passage from Landnáma book that recounts, I quote, "At that time, the country was divided into quarters, and there were to be 3 assemblies in each quarter and 3 men temple in each assembly area. Men were carefully chosen to take charge of the temples with wisdom and justice. They were to appoint judges at the assembly and oversee legal proceedings. Therefore, they were called chieftains. Each man had to pay a tax to the temple similar to today's church tithe." For the eastern part of Iceland, we have a complementary account of this passage that has come to us in the Brot af Þórðarsaga Review, according to one redaction called Vats Hirna, which is probably the most interesting because it continues a fragment of the unfortunately long lost first constitution, the Ulfljótslög. And it relates this little passage. "And when the country was divided into quarters, there were to be 3 assemblies per quarter and 3 men temples for each assembly. Men were chosen to guard the temples with conscientiousness and equity. They were to appoint judges at the assemblies and oversee legal proceedings. They were called temple chiefs this time. Every man had to pay a tax for the temple, much like today's church tithe." In the eastern region, again, in Altafjörður, another tale, the Þorsteinsþáttur Uxafot, offers a similar pattern and customs regarding the taking of land and the construction of a pagan temple. The Flateyjarbók redaction states, again, about similar testimony. "At that time, the country was divided into quarters with 3 assemblies in each quarter and 3 men temple in each assembly area. Men were carefully chosen to oversee the temple with wisdom and justice. They were to appoint judges at the assembly and oversee legal proceedings. Therefore, they were called chieftains. Each person had to pay a tax to the temple, similar to today's church tithe. Böðvar the White from Voss in Norway was the first to reside at Hof. He erected a temple there, or built a temple there, and became a temple chief, or the text says Hofgodi. In the opposite geographical direction from the previous 2 accounts, we have, of course, a very famous episode that you all know from Erbygja saga that describes the land taking in Breiðafjörður by the famous Þórólfur Mostraskegg, in which we learn that he established a large farm in Hofsvogr, which he called Hofstaðir, place of the temple. There he built a temple, and it was a grand structure. Further on, there are variation and addition to the previous account, such as all men had to pay a tax to the temple, and they had to accompany the temple chief to all assemblies, just as assemblymen now do for their leader. However, the chief had to maintain the temple at its own expense so that it did not fall into disrepair, and organize sacrificial feasts there. Finally, in a final episode of the Erbiga saga concerning the dispute that led to the famous relocation of the Thorsnes assembly from Hofstaðir to Þingvellir in Helgafellssveit, it highlights the role of the temple tax, which, collected by the building's owner, is used for his maintenance, and I'm quoting, furthermore, he, Þórður Gettler, announced that Þorgrímur Kjallason would maintain half of the temple, receive half of the temple tax, and have half of the assemblymen. Three main pieces of information emerge from these narrative sources. Firstly, the author provides a condensed view of the structures of pre-Christian Iceland and the development of the main temple or temple chief status in relation to other institutions such as district assemblies, or assembly zones. The text describes all the text without explicitly naming it, the role of what will become the Goðorðmaður, as per the law of Ulfljótur and the laws of Þórður Gettler, outlining that their privileges at the assembly include, among others, appointing judges and overseeing judicial proceeding. They refer also to the individual holding this function using the terms Godi, Hofgodi, and Mother. Okay, they will never use God or Mother. It is noteworthy that this text establishes a clear distinction between the role of a judge and the role of a chief, aligning actually with the teaching we got from one section of Grágás called Þingskapaþáttur, which separated the judicial and legislative powers. Moreover, these sources imbue this secular prerogative with the religious or at least cultic function, as the individual is referred to as the temple chief or chieftain. And there must exist 3 main temples or höfuðhof per assembly zone or þingsókn, totaling 12 for the entire country. Interestingly, despite mentioning the creation of districts, this text seemed to overlook the establishment of a 4th assembly zone in the northern region, which would have raised the total number of assembly zones to 13. Curiously enough, none of these sources make any reference to the Goðorð and seem to describe an older model predating the year 930 and the adoption of the first constitution, despite some reference in the text to the mid-960s with Þórður Gettler and this famous division of the country into districts. It appears that the authors face a chronology issue in portraying Iceland in the 10th century. Even though they attempt to place their narrative in a period post-dating the 960s, with the text often introduced using a temporal conjunction like we have often, when the country was divided into districts, or at that time the country was divided into district, Þá var landinu skipt í fjórðunga, that we always find since Ari's testimony. They indeed describe the constitutional situation of an earlier period. Without the reference to district, one could potentially place the setting even further back in time, suggesting not the second quarter of the 10th century, but the first, or perhaps the turn of the 10th century. This confusion suggests that these narratives overlap with the established understanding of the constitutional reforms of the 10th century, with key dates around 930, the establishment of the first legal institutions with 12 assemblies and the foundation of the Althingi, the General Assembly, and also around 965, the creation of districts and their assemblies, along with the addition of an extra assembly in the Northern District. As supportive evidence, the chronological sequence of this narrative align with the common perspective found in land-taking narrative. This text depicts such settlement within the context of local example located in the western and eastern region. They illustrate example of the settlement in Iceland at the end of the 9th century and the early development of institutions around influential colonizers, settlers, who constructed temples on their properties and assumed the title of Hofgoðar, such as Þorólfur Mostrarskegg in the Breiðafjörður and Böðvar Hviti Þorleifsson in the Altafjörður. It is known that Böðvar Hviti Þorleifsson took possession of the Hofferjagoðar immediately following the establishment of the Goðar system in Iceland and retained it until his death 5 years later. On the other hand, Þorólfur Mostrarskegg, presumably deceased or too old by 930, never exercised his office, which was passed directly to his heir, Thorstein Þorskabitur Þorólfsson, who possessed and owned the Þornesingagoðar from 930 to 938. These two regional narratives thus establish, and it's very important, a continuity between pagan priesthood, originating from the settlers' homeland in Norway, and the creation of the earliest Icelandic institution in 930. Additionally, it's worth mentioning and noting that Þorólfur Mostrarskegg is known from our sources to be one of the founders of the three oldest local assemblies, including that of Thorsnes. Therefore, before the establishment of the Althingi and the spring assembly system, we have evidence of settlers constructing temple, uniting supporters, and establishing local assemblies near their residence. This situation aligns with a common model in mainland Scandinavia. Finally, we observe in some of these narratives a custom of Hoftotler, temple tax. We are told that these temple chiefs were supposed to receive a temple tax paid by the member of their assembly zone. 3 redaction provides similar information, which is every man had to pay a tax to the temple similar to today's church tithe. Hver skyldi og gjalda töll til hof, sá sem nú kirkjutíund. And I have that in 3 different versions, always the same text. The authors attempt to explain a pagan custom by transposing it into a Christian context, equating or putting on the same level the temple tax on one hand with the real Christian tithe on the other hand. The Danish scholar Olaf Holsen has raised several warnings about the actual existence of this temple tax, noting that all of these sources were written, of course, at a time where the tithe was actually collected in Iceland. Furthermore, in the same didactic effort towards the reader, the third quote regarding the temple tax continues to state that those men who are attached to a temple chief had to, in addition to the tax, accompany him to the assemblies and correspond basically to the assemblymen of today, says the text. And I'm quote, "Sem nu men hövdinge." This last point is important for dating the time of the narrative, as we are in a pre-Christian context preceding the millennium, but more importantly, in a time that predates the relationship between a chief and its assemblymen. That is even before the establishment of the laws of Ulfljótur and the Goðor system, as the bond that unites the two main political actors in ancient Iceland is basically of a religious nature and become consolidated by the chief's temple. I'm almost done. The wealth collected by the temple owner could be a source of conflict within a single region or even a community, as illustrated in the Thorskfirðinga saga, also known as Gullþóris saga. Quote, "The importance of Hofhallur grew to the extent that he came close to owning all the wealth and honor of every man. He fought with the people of Reykjanes over the temple tax. He also wanted to collect the taxes to the west of Þorskafjörður, but Hallstein and the people of Reykjanes had built a temple of Thor, Thor's Hof. There in the west, after the great tree washed ashore on his land, and after he made a sacrifice for it, and they legally established a tax at that location. Because of this, great enmity grew between them and Hallur." End of the quote. The Kjalnesinga saga offers some information also about a Hofgoði that runs a temple. We learn that a powerful man called Thorgrimur built a temple at Hof, and it became a very popular place because it was a sacred haven for families and friends. And this man became, according to the text, powerful in this region. The text uses the word héraðsríkur, and his authority goes all the way to Nýjarun, and he was owning a Goðor called Bryndaelagoðor, and we call him Thorgrimur Goði. He was a huge sacrificator, and he built a huge temple on his own land of many feet long and over 60 feet large. And everyone under his authority had to pay a tax to the temple, and the main god was Thor. So they were giving sacrifices to Thor. Most well-known Egil saga gives another account about the temple tax. Otur was the leader in Borgarfjörður, south of Krita. He was a chief of the temple, Hofgoði again, and he ran the temple where all men up to the interior of Skarðsheiður paid a temple tax. So, the Viking Age period in Iceland undeniably featured a rich tapestry of rituals. These rituals encompassed various practices, including feast, foundation deposit, blood sacrifices, and so on, occurring both within or outside the halls of the festive hall during that time. The spatial relationship between these rituals and the halls remain a question, with some evidence mostly drawn from Hofstadr, suggesting a significance of the earth. The sagas that we have backing up, in this case, some archaeological result, written 200 years after the conversion of Iceland to Christianity, they contain several elements that appear anachronistic, like I've been quoting now, and are more reflective on the time of writing than of the event they depict. The description we get of the pagan past in ancient Scandinavia and furthermore in Iceland for my study here is not exempt from this pattern and is influenced strongly by the Christian ideology of the authors. The so-called temple priests seem to correspond more or less to church-owning leaders who opposed themselves to religious elites during the 12th and 13th century in Iceland. The temple tax, I hope I convince you, strangely echoes the ecclesial tithe introduction in 1100, a major event in Icelandic medieval history, if not one of the most important one. The portrayal of priestesses in opposition to Christian missionaries serves actually, even in the lovely Vapferinga saga, serves to convey the message of Christianity, notably through the virtue of charity. At the risk of disappointing enthusiasts of paganism, the sagas that feature priests and priestesses of the temple shed more light on the history of medieval Iceland and its society than on the ancient Nordic paganism and its practitioners. Archaeology tends today to associate religious practice or sacrifice, the so-called blot, with the hearth, and is therefore immediately linked to the interpretation we have given of the hearth as the great hall of the house, of the long house. The sacrificial was thus, or therefore, the master of the house, whether referred to as the bondi, the godi, the hofgodi, all terms designating for me the elite in ancient Iceland. Derived from the verb blota, religious belief or practice among the ancient Icelanders and Scandinavian seem to have varied depending on geographical region, which are important. I hope I stressed it enough that I took example from various fjords, which were quite different from each other. And they remain, this belief, this practice, even though we've been working a lot on that, they remain largely unknown. It should be noted also that the term blot mother, another interesting construct that we haven't addressed that much during this conference, but maybe for another one. This term referring to the practitioner is often synonymous with magician or sorcerer. It was the main habilitation thesis of my director, François-Xavier Dillman, about magician in ancient Norse sources. The sacrificial was responsible for sacrificial banquet, blood vesla, that took place 3 times a year. But this, of course, is another topic for hopefully another conference. Thank you so much for listening to me, and I will let Victor take over from this. Thank you.
I'm sorry, without the sound.
Yeah.
Going again. So thank you. That was very interesting. I told you I'm not an expert on the theme, but I do have some questions that I will take for the end. I will ask the questions that are on the chat first. So I will start with a question from Professor Johnny Langer, which is from Navy. He's recalling an article from Professor Terry Gunnell, and Gunnell questions the existence of separate temple buildings in Iceland. And the question is, how do you view this study? What's the relation between this study and how do you perceive these questions?
So I tackled this problem with the semi-excavated house and the famous Blóthus, sacrificial house that we start to have found. So mostly in this case study I had from Bjarni Einarsson, it's not brand new. It has, I think the study is like 15 years old, 20 years old already, time flies. But that we might have had this, I'm very shared on that because I'm not a specialist in ancient Iceland in archaeology. I work a lot extensively with result reports, stuff like that, mostly from Ori Vestensen and his team. I think it's a good point, but what we see, it's mostly the main trend has been, like I said, both. We have the famous Longhouse, the festival. We've been working and publishing extensively on this subject. It's very important. But today we think that it's also true that they had blood sacrificial houses existing in parallel. So they were separate buildings. For a long time, archaeologists believed they were workshops, they were places where they kept the slave, places where the women were weaving the famous vadmal, stuff like that. But today we found some stuff. We found also like animal bones that would suggest sacrifices, not just for eating. It's not garbage or a garbage place. So there's a lot of question, and this really truly merits a real studies. So I hope we will have more case coming together, and that's why the article of Terry was very good, because it puts together some ideas, and I hope the younger generation of archaeologists will take up on that and study it, because we have this, and it will actually go in favor of my theory for the transition of cult in Iceland and the change from little building into conversion churches. On my paper on tithing in Iceland, I went extensively on this case by case, with all these buildings, and to have basically a huge parallel in between, and the processes was long. I'm talking now of 100 years processes to have this put together. So during this time, of course, it's not in one day that the house or the little house was changing to a place of cult. I hope it answers your question, Johnny.
Sure. So we'll go back again to archaeology and look into that. Johnny again asks on how archaeology considers the temples of Upokra and Tiso in the Danish Viking era, period era, and the separate buildings from the Longhouse that you mentioned. Yeah. And he's asking, how can we analyze these findings comparing to the Icelandic case?
Yeah, that will be a bit different, and I will tell you in a simple explanation why it's different. Is that in the Danish context, we are more facing an elite warlike society, which dates back way longer from the Roman age and stuff, and we have been having this type of, I would say, continental tradition. In Iceland, it's mostly farm-based structure. That's why in my conclusion, I was introducing the term of bondi, or householder, or farmer, and stuff like that. So that's why we will have it mostly around the farm. At the time of Pagan Iceland, they did not have a structure in society that came even close to, I would say, not chieftain based, but elites, as we can see in Northern Europe at that time. And we had to wait until, basically, for me, it's a theory, the concentration of power, so the 12th century in Iceland, to see power being gathered in the hand of a few members of the elite, and the birth of the true elite, copying tradition inherited or stolen or inspired by Northern Europe and medieval Europe. Most of my thesis was based on that, the influence of this famous seigneurial society that came up to life in the Sturtling period in Iceland. That's different.
Sure. One of my questions was related to that one on the Danish side. I was thinking on the Swedish side. You started your presentation with the vignette from Olaus Magnus' Historia, and I saw the idea of the temple of Uppsala, Gamla Uppsala. And I was actually wondering on that. You mentioned how Hof could be related to a toponym on hills, and the archaeology site on Gamla Uppsala is based on hills also, different kind of hills. But so my question was kind of on Johnny's one on how this could be, how the Icelandic context could be compared to the Swedish one, or would you say it's also more on the elite side, such as
I mean, if you think of Gamla Uppsala, that's definitely something to do with the Vendel period before, and it's very elite-based and martially based. Quite different. Another stuff that could be interesting, they have a special place to the god Freyr in these regions. Danish would have a focus on Odin, if I'm correct, or Wotan, and then in Iceland it will be Thor. Most of the toponym I gave in my example from Landnámabækur and other medieval sources were always mentioning Thor. Think of Thorolfur Mostrarskeg and Thorsnes Assembly, and dedicated to also to Thor. So that would be also different type of gods or structure for this, for Uppsala. But there's one thing that you raised which is important, is because they all practiced Old Norse, they all talked in Old Norse, the use of place name and the role of place names also is very interesting, because the category I quoted at the beginning from the Danish savant Olaf Olsen is this Hörgur, Hof. You have also a connection to a hill, a mountain top, something to do with a geographical site. So that's something that might be in connection to that.
Sure. Yes. So that's very interesting. I also saw the image on a ring, a blood ring that you put on. So it was from Sweden. That's why I ended up.
And we have it in the sources also in the text, is this one, the blood vessel ring with the little runic inscription made by Botolver. So that's from Uppland runic inscription. And the cool stuff is that we describe that in the first sources I quoted from the legendary saga. They describe like these sacrificial rings. There's one also, I took it out because I could not find it. That was short time, as you know. But I have one from the Museum of Iceland of a blood kettle, so like a bowl basically, where they will use what in Latin we call aspergillum, which is also part of the transition of cult, where you will use that to sprinkle something like, I quoted Pope Gregory saying that they will reuse the temples, reuse the tradition, but have holy water instead, and bless the pagan inside of the temple into a Christian area. So we found like some artifacts that are actually backing up old school romantic depiction we had in the mid 19th century. I quoted like the Grimm testimony and other that were like popular by that time, but archaeology had brought today a lot of interesting artifacts. Another difference, to go back, because I see the stuff Danish finding comparing to the Icelandic is rural, so we will not have like gold foil altar like made of gold and stuff like that. It would be harder to find that, but we'll have more rustic. We have more like they will talk also in the sort of the trädgård, like carving made of wood. They don't have to be recovered with golden leaves and stuff like that. So it's more farm-like society. That's why also I believe that the bondi, the householder, is really the key character in that. I don't know if we have to call him a Hofgodi or not for the Icelandic context, even if some authors were calling them like that, like trying to copy and adapt the situation they knew of the government of their time and the assemblyman. But it's also a good point.
Sure. So let's keep talking on the temples. So we have Pablo, which is a member of our group, and it's quite of a long question. I'll try my best to express on language so we can talk a little bit more on that. But Pablo is asking on the difficulty on establishing networks between the Godar and their followers and the existence of these temples.
Mm-hmm.
So Pablo recalls how these descriptions of temples and their existence is kind of rare in some Icelandic sagas, as you actually pointed out today, and how the strength of authority on Icelandic chieftains often appears in these descriptions on other texts, such as problem resolutions assemblies or the realm of laws and the number of followers, for example. So the question is, are there descriptions of spaces, items, or customs that may describe or indicate the existence of these temples without directly mentioning the existence of temples?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of the question here.
I will try to sum it up.
Sure.
Answer it. But Pablo, if you want, I have 200 pages in my thesis on this specific subject. And there's one main point about this. That would be the difference. You have to establish a difference. We're going more in detail. A difference about höfðingi and Godormaður or Godi, because these two concepts are different. Even if some höfðingar held a Godar or were called Godi or Godar in the sources, they did not have to be Godar men. or owner of the Godel. And one of the main problem I had also when I wrote my thesis on that was when I was working on the birth of communities in medieval Iceland and working on the elites and who was actually running the communities, I realized that we had a concept that we can draw to anthropology, and I did a lot of it through legal anthropology, of two different concepts. And I'm not using Bourdieu for that, I'm using hardcore anthropologists Maurice Godelier and Patrick Clastre, which are French anthropologists, that make a distinguo between power and prestige. Okay, which Bourdieu will do later on with some symbolic stuff. But I want to do it like hardcore with chieftaincy. You have power and prestige, these two concepts. What I have done, I map every single community in Iceland. I managed to excavate all of them. And for each of them, I could find, according to the written sources, of course, the main leaders of each community at one time of history, at one time of the famous Commonwealth period. In this, you always have in the text a distinguo. In some communities, some of these höfðingjar were also owner of the Godel. So they had control over the assemblymen in the constitutional way that I quoted earlier in my presentation, that you have in Graugaus and all of the sagas also. You have this same system. But some of them were just höfðingjar, or even called bændur, bondi, bændar, whatever, but they were like big farmers. And I realized also in some inheritance pattern between, for example, two sons, the guy that was owning, it happened in the in the east of Iceland, in the Eastfjord. We have one testimony of this, where the owner of the Godor, who is also a höfðingi, a powerful leader, is héraðríkur. That's the term. So he's like a big man, as we say in anthropology, as Godelier wrote, in his region. In this case, he has two sons. One is a good talker. He's good with business. He's good like with men and stuff. He inherits of the Godor. So he's the guy who's going to take the assemblyman to the Althingi and represent the affair of the family over there. The other son, who is actually a hard worker, is well known in his neighboring community, is respected, is powerful, he has power, becomes höfðingi. And he says also in the text, you will be a good bondi, my son, a good farmer, okay? And we've realized that the one that has the power is actually the one that becomes höfðingi. So my main thesis in this is that, and I'm following one of my colleagues from University of Iceland called Helgi Skúli Kjartansson, who was the first one to propose that, and I've been also publishing a lot on that the Godor was just the right to sit at the General Assembly, whereas the fact of being bondi or höfðingi was actually the one owning power and control of the men within the local community. So that's a huge distinguo that we have, and I have to back me up like hundreds of examples that I have mapped specifically, and I have mapped them geographically in each community in medieval Iceland. I don't remember the number, but I think at the end I found for the Commonwealth period 269 communities, whereas before I started my research we had not even 8 I think communities that we got from the medieval sources, and it was impossible to map them, and I think I managed to do it quite nicely. But what I realized is that the höfðingi is the real powerful man in this. So I don't know if it answers some part of it for the spaces and the assemblyman stuff compared to what you had, Pablo. Well, but I'm sure this research would help you actually to map it from the pagan time, knowing again that for me it's mostly a reflection of the 11th, 12th, 13th century than, I hope I was clear enough, than a mirror of the Viking or pagan past, which I don't really believe in.
Yeah, Pablo expressed that yes, you actually answered him, so very interesting.
Send me a mail if it's Pablo Miranda.
Yes, it is.
Okay, no.
Yeah.
Good. I'll send you my work if you want, and you can read it. I know you read French.
Yeah, so it's actually very interesting. So that was one of my comments on your presentation. I find it really interesting that exploring the concept as a conceptual history, in a sense, you put together archaeology and philology and sources, which is a necessary tool in the sense that only philology sometimes can lead us to wrong answers. 100%. Because we're sometimes looking for things that are impossible to see. So when you talk about mapping these communities and relating them to archaeology, it's actually fascinating. So very, very interesting work. We do have one more question here from Guilherme, which is here with us. His question is in the possibility to observe a continuity between pre-Christian sacred spaces 100%. And the buildings of churches as a way of previously sacred places. How it's related, these constructions of a new religious logic on top of a previous one.
Yeah, that's exactly the transition of cult I've been mentioning. Remember the letter to Abbot Melitius. This is what we see in Iceland. Like I said, Steinunn Kristjánsdóttir, she did amazing research on Seyðisfjörður, was the awakening of Christianity in Iceland, and it was very groundbreaking. She did her PhD in Göteborg University in Sweden about this Icelandic subject, case studies. Since then, she moved a lot into monastery archaeology. She's the leading expert in the world today on this, Nordic monastic culture and archaeology. But I believe this transition of cult was a thing because it was the main political argument we got from the Roman Church. So they were basically building that as much as they could. It makes perfect sense. You don't destroy something that works. You don't destroy and burn down some places that are considered sacred. If you're familiar with the Christianization of Iceland, you know that it was a progressive phenomenon, that it was made peacefully, which is quite interesting enough to notice it and underlines it, that it took time. And every time that we had some faction at the assembly in the year like 980, we always had mediators, either sent by the King of Norway or by a bishop or a missionary, that tried to convert some high-hand leaders. We have it in the Eastfjord, for example. We have a lot of tradition like that in the early Christian text of missionaries and Christianization of Iceland, Kristni Saga and so on. All these accounts, you have the same stuff, that instead of antagonizing the two parties and destroying stuff on behalf of Christianity, you have to always think of it as Icelandic context. They were not many. They were all related. Not saying they were all inbred. I'm not saying that. My wife will kill me for that. But they were all related. They were not more than 60,000 people at that time. We believe between 40,000 to 60,000. Iceland is a big country. It's quite big if you imagine it. It's like the size of Spain without Catalonia. The West, some Catalan would love to see Spain. But it's basically this huge geographical ensemble. So it's quite huge. You have only 40 to 60,000 people. They all come from same ancestors. At that time that we took on Christianity in Iceland, they've been here for like what, 2, 3 generations, 4 generations. So no, they kept that. I was talking also, Guillermo, that yesterday when we had our pre-briefing, that we have found now in Iceland, we have caves that we know. So we have the archaeological proof that the Papar, the missionaries, the hermits, the monks were living in Iceland about 100 years prior to the settlement of Iceland. We only had this line in the Book of Icelander from Ari that Papar were living in Iceland before the settlers from Norway came. And then they just vanished and they left like church cloth, books, and bells, if I remember my Icelandic book correctly. Today we have dated caves, and it's in Hetla in the south of Iceland. We have that. We have found also for like 2 summers in Oddi, the famous center of power of the Odaverjar family. We found the underground complex in Oddi that is also a cave, man-made cave, that predates the oldest settlement we had from the Viking Age. So that's very interesting. There's a lot of other like research going in that direction. So to have a continuity, yes, Guillaume, there's definitely a continuity. They did not burn like you have in Romantic myth that the priest or the Christian missionary will call and burn temples and stuff like that. That will never work for these communities. They were neighbors. You have to go back. If you study feuding in medieval Iceland, you know it perfectly that we have different steps in the escalation of the conflict. But at one point, the society has to come back to an agreement and live together because winter is coming, because there's a lack of food, problem with the weather, volcanic eruption, ashes, cloud of ashes coming down on you. It's Iceland. So there's a lot of stuff going on that the community will stick together and protect each other. So we don't have real clash Christian against pagan that we can have in all the concept of conversion of Scandinavia, for example. If you think of King Saint Olaf in Stiklestad, that's another stuff. Okay, that's not stuff that we had in Iceland. Again, farmers communities, neighboring communities, more or less peaceful communities, trying first of all to survive and to struggle for survivance in an hospitable country, which I made my home, so I'm probably masochistic.
Very nice. So,
yeah, is it good?
Yes, you did. Very much did. So these are the questions for today, actually. I would like to know if you have any closing words that you want to say, any more, any other things. We're going.
Always say the same stuff. Read the sagas.
Absolutely.
Don't read what scholars write. It's crap. Every 30 years we come up with new stuff, so don't bother. Go to the text. Go back to the text. It's super important. We still have a lot of work to do with the saga. Put the text in one hand, archaeological in the other hand. If you can sprinkle a little bit of anthropology to understand how they were thinking at that time, that will help you. The saga still have a lot to offer. The low code are not studied enough, so I really encourage every student I have to read Graugaus, to read the code, to read also the diplomatic sources and stuff. It's very interesting. Contemporary history is cool, is hot, is hip. It's a good subject. Go to it. Compare Iceland to medieval Europe. That's very interesting. Compare Iceland to medieval Scandinavia. Super interesting. Put together like some chapter from Graugaus with the Gulathingslög. They're supposed to come from the same source. Compare that. There's a lot of comparative history or legal history to do. So please, the field is wide. I'm happy to see it growing. Thanks to Johnny and other wonderful scholars in Brazil. It really makes me happy. And I want to say a note, like a personal note. It's targeted to you, Johnny. It's when you came once to France on the invitation of my old professor, Régis Boyer, we were talking and they were like, imagine, they start like being interested in Viking mythology all the way to Brazil today. So it's amazing. So I know he would have been so happy to be alive today and to have seen that in Brazil you have so many people and nice people interested in that and going all the way to get a curriculum in Viking and medieval Scandinavia, as exotic it can seem for us, at least as exotic as Brazil is for us, to work on the Tupinamba Indians or any other subject. And it's very interesting. So I'm very happy and I encourage all of you to go because on this subject, it's a very interesting subject.
Very nice.
That would be for my concluding word, Victor.
Thank you very much. It was really interesting.
Obrigado.
Yeah, thank you. So in Portuguese right now for the audience, nós temos agora às 16h30 a sessão de comunicação 1, né, para vocês participarem, e às 19 horas o minicurso. Então vocês são bem-vindos para continuar acompanhando a nossa semana aí do CEVE, que começou hoje e já começou de forma brilhante. Espero vocês na próxima. Grégory, thank you very much. I hope to see you again another time and we can chat more about early medieval Iceland.
For sure, for sure. Thank you so much, everyone. Take care and happy conference and good luck to the other speakers. Cheers.
Cheers.